hiring, and administration costs. So planning, hiring, and administration costs are all of the ancillary costs that go into being involved in this sort of program, from an administration, from a human resources point of view, from the time that it takes to plan out how many apprentices or trainees you want in your company, to how long it takes to sign their contracts and all of that kind of thing. So these are kind of the indirect company related costs that are involved in being a part of this sort of program. And then finally, you have classroom education costs, which may be high or they may be low or nothing, depending on the context that you're in. So in some systems, you might, as a company, be expected to contribute a certain amount of money to the time that the apprentices spend or the trainees spend, not in your workplace, but rather in the classroom. But again, that depends on the context of the program, how much of it might be funded by other sources, namely the government, Department of Education, and that kind of thing. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to stick with using the word apprentices when I'm talking about people who are in the talking about the people who are training in the company, and I'm probably going to talk about apprenticeship when I'm talking about these programs. Those words are not necessarily the words that will be used everywhere. And I know that from my experience in Chile, you often also refer to people who do this kind of training in the workplace also as students. But it's the most common way that we use for it. And if I don't just stick with apprentices, I'm going to get mixed up. And so I think it's quicker just to choose one and stay with it. But just keep in mind that I might be talking, what I'm saying might be meaning something different to you. So that's the cost side. On the benefit side, the first thing we have is the productive value. So how much additional value can having an apprentice in your company generate by doing productive work? And how much that's going to be is going to vary on a few different things, which I'm going to present a little bit later on. Now, that's sort of the easiest thing to think about when you think about it from a company's perspective. Okay, you actually get this apprentice to do some work, and the work that they do generates some kind of productive value for you. But that's not the only kind of benefit you get. You might also get a save on recruiting and hiring costs, because you've already got young people in the system who you can then, if you want to, keep on afterwards. You already know a little bit about their productivity, and so it's going to take them a little bit less time to integrate into your company, which also links to the third point here, which is saved adjustment costs. So when you hire somebody new, you'll often have adjustment costs because they're not quite used to the way that you do things. The machinery might come from a slightly different manufacturer. You might be using Apple computers instead of Windows computers and all of these kinds of things. But if you've developed what you might want to call a talent pipeline through some sort of an apprenticeship program, you also save on these kinds of costs. And the savings that you make on those kinds of costs by hiring previous apprentices rather than having to go through the hiring process anew for somebody who you want to be at full productivity are also a type of benefit to being involved in some sort of an apprenticeship program. So it's not just the upfront benefit that you get from the young person, from the apprentice being doing some kind of productive work during their training. You also have the saved costs later on if they choose to stay on.
Plazo si es que ellos deciden permanecer en la empresa. Entonces, ese es un análisis general de los costos y beneficios que hay involucrados, pero quiero entrar en detalle en lo que se puede ver a lo largo de un periodo de aprendizaje. Entonces, en esta siguiente diapositiva podemos ver aquí que básicamente tenemos un dibujo muy sencillo de un gráfico del periodo de aprendizaje. Deliberadamente no puse una línea de tiempo. Es una cierta duración y en ese tiempo lo primero que tienes es los costos de aprendizaje, de capacitación. Y la manera en que modelamos esto, vemos que los costos de capacitación van en aumento. Se detienen hasta un cierto momento y durante el programa van aumentando. La razón principal de que esto ocurre es que en muchas situaciones, este es el caso por lo menos en Suiza, algo pasó aquí. Volvimos, aquí estamos. Este es el riesgo cuando muchas personas pueden controlar una pantalla, supongo. ¿Dónde estaba? Estaba aquí, muy bien. La razón principal por la que los costos de capacitación suben es porque la mayoría de los contextos, a medida que progresa el programa, sube el sueldo de los aprendices. Comienzan entre 600 800 francos suizos al mes al comienzo del programa, pero al final del programa generan ya cobran más de 1.000 francos. En contexto suizo, estos son sueldos bajos. Quiero hacer énfasis que no sé cuál es la conversión de moneda, pero es una fracción de lo que un sueldo promedio es en una clase de trabajo. Estos son los costos de aprendizaje, de capacitación, van en aumento porque los aprendices les sube el sueldo y tal vez incrementan los costos porque además aprenden a usar implementos y herramientas más complicadas y eso a ustedes finalmente en remuneración y supervisión les puede salir más costoso. Entonces, los empleados que ya están capacitados tienen que tomar tiempo de su trabajo para supervisar al aprendiz también. Esos son los costos de aprendizaje. Luego tenemos el valor productivo del participante.
Y lo que pueden ver es que básicamente asumimos que al comienzo era una producción equivalente como a un trabajador ya capacitado. Y al final del programa están ganando básicamente el salario de un trabajador capacitado porque básicamente tienen las mismas aptitudes. A diferencia de los costos, el valor productivo, vamos a ver que hay muchas cosas que tienen que aprender al comienzo, mucha información nueva que deben recibir, así que esto va a ser lento. Sin embargo, a mediados del programa, cuando ya han cubierto lo básico de todo lo que se tiene que aprender, es que vamos a tener un periodo en que la productividad va a empezar a incrementar rápidamente, donde van a poder hacer tareas más complejas, a pensar por sí mismo, en lugar de requerir el acompañamiento de una persona. Así que a mediados del programa pueden ver que la línea empieza a angularse hacia arriba, se vuelve un poco más empinada. Pero hacia el final del programa, una vez que ya han aprendido la mayor parte de las partes complejas y se trata ahora de afinar y perfeccionar las cosas que ya han sido aprendidas, ahí empieza a estancarse un poco este valor productivo. Así que, por un lado, tienen esta productividad incrementada para la empresa, pero luego en el lado derecho también pueden ver que hay un beneficio post-entrenamiento para quien participó, porque ahora esta persona va a poder tener un salario bastante más alto porque ahora es una persona mucho más capacitada, con muchas mejores herramientas. Así que pueden ver que hay un beneficio financiero tanto para la empresa como para el aprendiz. Así que, si juntamos estas dos cosas, podemos ver que en el programa que estamos modelando aquí, al comienzo, los costos de entrenamiento son más altos que la productividad del aprendiz. Así que la compañía al comienzo está gastando más dinero de lo que está generando el aprendiz. Es un costo para la empresa. Sin embargo, a mediados de este programa en particular, van a ver que hay un punto en que el valor productivo supera los costos y por el resto del programa se va a mantener por encima. Así que en este ejemplo particular tenemos un programa de aprendizaje que está bastante bien balanceado, en el que tenemos un periodo equivalente de inversión y de retornos. Así que la compañía básicamente estaría haciendo un cero neto, no estaría ganando ni perdiendo. En comparación del comienzo del programa, hacia el final del programa ellos van a empezar a recibir más y ahí van a poder decidir si van a querer retener a este aprendiz. Naturalmente, no es tan simple como lo que les estoy presentando aquí. Aquí elegí, bueno, de hecho no les he mostrado ni siquiera un periodo de tiempo para esto. Así que ahora podemos empezar a jugar con ciertos parámetros dentro de este modelo para ver cómo esto podría afectar el tiempo total que pasamos en el periodo de inversión y en el tiempo de retornos, para ver si esto es finalmente más o menos atractivo para la empresa. Así que lo primero que tenemos aquí son los salarios del aprendiz. Como les dije anteriormente, esto va a variar muchísimo de país a país. En Suiza, por ejemplo, no tenemos salario mínimo en Suiza. Así que las empresas no están sometidas a las leyes de salario mínimo como en otros países. Sin embargo, otra cosa que ocurre, hay dos puntos importantes. Lo primero es que los aprendices son considerados estudiantes y por tanto no necesariamente van a tener derechos a los salarios completos que se les pagan a los otros empleados. Además de eso, no se les pagan salarios completos porque suelen trabajar 3 o 4 días semanales. Así que este es el contexto suizo, donde los salarios para los aprendices son bastante bajos y los costos de entrenamientos vamos a ver que son relativamente bajos, como vamos a ver en el ejemplo de aquí. Así que el periodo de inversión es bastante corto y el periodo de entrenamiento es bastante más largo y así los retornos van a ser también bastante más considerables a lo largo del tiempo, mientras el programa esté en curso. Y esto es de hecho lo que observamos en las distintas empresas promedio en Suiza. Este es el promedio, como decía anteriormente, en el que las compañías suizas suelen tener un muy buen beneficio de tener programas de entrenamiento. La segunda posibilidad, sin embargo, es cómo se utiliza el tiempo del aprendiz mientras está en la empresa. Así que originalmente habíamos asumido que cierto tiempo ha sido utilizado para el trabajo productivo por el aprendiz, pero aquí estamos diciendo, ok, tal vez el aprendiz está pasando cierto tiempo en la empresa, pero no tanto de ese tiempo en actividades productivas y bastante más en actividades no productivas. Así que está haciendo cosas por hacer cosas en vez de hacer cosas realmente para impactar positivamente. Básicamente no está haciendo trabajo productivo y eso significa que el valor productivo de los participantes baja en relación a lo que teníamos en nuestro modelo anterior. Y eso resulta en un periodo de inversión bastante más largo y un periodo de retornos bastante más corto. Y este tipo de programa sería una pérdida probablemente en términos netos para la compañía. Y esto es lo que vemos hasta cierto punto en Alemania, que es algo que les voy a presentar un poco más adelante. Y finalmente, lo último que les quería mostrar es la duración del programa. Así que asumamos que por cualquier razón este programa tenía una cierta duración, pero tiene que ser reducido. Todo se mantiene igual, la productividad, la, la curva de productividad del aprendiz se mantiene igual. Sin embargo, el tiempo durante el cual la compañía podría generar un retorno se va a reducir considerablemente. Y por tanto, la empresa también va a ser una pérdida neta en este escenario. Esto es algo de lo que les voy a hablar más adelante, porque esto es básicamente lo que está ocurriendo en Chile. Los programas son demasiado cortos para que las empresas sean capaces de generar un beneficio neto de estos programas de aprendizaje. Y por tanto, la mayoría de las empresas chilenas finalmente tienen una pérdida en estos modelos. Así que espero que todo esté bien. Perfecto, voy a continuar. Finalmente vamos a hablar sobre los retornos después de que termina el programa. ¿Qué tan rentable fue esto? En algunos contextos ocurre y en otros no, pero algo que es posible que ocurra, y nuevamente es lo que ocurre en Alemania, donde generalmente suelen tener pérdidas a través del programa mismo. Sin embargo, muchas compañías alemanas continúan participando en estos programas, y esta es la compresión de sueldos. Esto significa que las compañías aceptan un aprendiz sabiendo que es una pérdida, porque saben que van a tener luego una negociación colectiva una vez que acabe esto y van a pagar un salario más bajo de lo que realmente es su productividad. Así que por eso hay una diferencia, como pueden ver en este gráfico, respecto de los valores productivos y los salarios una vez que el programa acaba. Esto realmente es muy contextual y va a depender de los acuerdos colectivos de negociación. Pero esto puede ser poco común en ciertos contextos y es un riesgo bastante considerable que hay que considerar, en el que un programa puede no generar ganancias. Pero no se preocupen porque luego van a tener finalmente esta compresión de salarios. Bueno, ¿nos está moviendo la diapositiva? Ok, ahora sí. Básicamente, este es un modelo muy sencillo, muy simplificado, pero espero que no haya sido demasiado complejo y que quería mostrarles para ayudarnos a comprender la siguiente parte de la presentación, donde les voy a mostrar evidencia de distintas partes del mundo antes de pasar a las evidencias del estudio que realizamos y sobre todo las empresas en Chile. Así que me voy a detener aquí y si hay alguna pregunta que alguien tenga para esta primera parte de la presentación, las recibo con gusto.
Entonces, los estamos invitando ahora a que hagan su pregunta. Ahora está súper interesante, Patrick, así que estamos ansiosos para ver cómo sigue la segunda parte. Yo creo que cuando continúes probablemente van a surgir comentarios. Es súper interesante lo que estás comentándonos, así que bueno, si aquí apareció estoy mirando los mensajes para ver si hay mensajes. Por ahí me dicen, todavía no hay preguntas aún, así que están todos atentos a cómo continúan. Sigamos.
Ahí hay una pregunta.
Aquí hay una pregunta, ¿cierto? Aquí hay una pregunta. Dice, ¿en Suiza y Alemania se ha preparado o existe como parte, o existe como parte del modelo la escuela de supervisores de aprendices y los pasos transversales para que esto pueda alinearse con la estrategia? Ok. En Suiza y Alemania entonces ha preparado o existe como parte de este modelo una escuela de supervisores para aprendices. Si fuera así, los pasos para que esto pueda alinearse con la estrategia del negocio. ¿Qué has visto tú o qué saben
Strategy.
ustedes respecto a cómo
What do
esto
you
puede
know
conectarse
about
con
this and
la
how
estrategia del
this
negocio?
could connect with the business strategy?
So yes, you're right. So in certainly in Switzerland, and I don't know the German context as well as I know the Swiss one, but the people who are in the companies who are in charge of supervising the apprenticeships, they have all done some level of extra schooling, and depending on what exactly they're doing, that might just be, say, a 2-week course where they learn some really basic pedagogical skills, or it might be a longer 6 month up to 1 year kind of diploma that actually formally qualifies them as a vocational teacher. How that aligns with business strategies. Now, I want to come from this from the first angle to say that there's a reason that I work at a university and not in a company, and I can't necessarily answer that for every business, but what I can say is that this is a really good way to firstly to keep people on who you really want to keep on by offering them new challenges, for instance. And so it's often, particularly in jobs that really highly technical or perhaps highly physical. This is often the sort of thing that might be given to somebody who's worked in the company for quite a long time, who still wants to be actively working in the company, but may not have the physicality left to be able to be working on heavy machinery 5 days a week. So rather than saying, okay, well, you can't work on heavy machinery 5 days a week, goodbye, you can say, okay, well, why don't we reduce your heavy machinery load to 3 days a week or 2 days a week, and then the other 3 days a week you can take care of the apprentices and show them the ropes. So that's one example of how it might work in some sort of company. These are also, though, I would say, the kinds of skills that are really transferable to other parts of other parts of running a company, so to sort of human resource management and that kind of thing. And so I think that to have staff who are well trained to be able to show new people what to do is generally a benefit for the company in general, because it means that they're thinking more deeply about how they might be the processes they might be doing, how they might be able to optimize them, and all of that kind of thing. So I hope that that's a first answer to that question, but I understand it's also a very kind of academically minded one.
Ujú, ujú.
Muy
Sí,
interesante.
pero la práctica también es necesario, Patrick, ¿no? Estaba pensando a partir de vincularlos con prácticas de reconocimiento, con personas que lo han hecho bien en su desempeño y cómo entonces se puede hacer un reskilling, ¿no? O reconvertir para que puedan acompañar y en todo también lo que es sucesión del liderazgo a partir del potencial de desarrollo. Es un proyecto bonito, ¿no? Que puede marcar mucha diferencia. Eh, sí, eso.
Súper bonito.
Absolutely, and I agree completely with that sentiment.
Patrick, ¿y qué opinas respecto a que hayan incentivos económicos para las personas que hagan esas funciones complementarias? Y la otra pregunta es, ¿existen en los países que nos cuentas, en Suiza, en Alemania, incentivos económicos asociados a las empresas que se comprometen con este tipo de programa?
Okay. So to the first question, in terms of the incentives of people to take on this load, it varies in practice from company to company, and it probably depends on the size of the company itself. So large companies, and I can see that I can see at least one person from Nestle here. So let's take Nestle as an example. Nestle in Switzerland has an entire department, or at least an entire part of their HR department who is probably in charge of this. And so to that extent, it's not necessarily an incentive for doing a good job, but rather a job within the company in and of itself. However, if you want to have somebody who is supervising the job of the person from day to day, the kind of incentives that entails, probably, again, it depends on individual company policies. Certainly in Switzerland, there's no rule that says if you are taking on taking care of apprentices, then you get paid X amount more. In practice, is probably what happens in a lot of contexts, but it isn't necessarily written down to say, okay, yes, absolutely, you have to get paid more. So again, in Switzerland, in any case, we have a pretty liberal regime on this, and it's up to the companies internally to decide how they're doing it, as long as the quality of the apprenticeship is guaranteed. As long as that's guaranteed, and as long as the people who are working day to day with the apprentices do have the qualification that's required, how the companies organize that is totally up to them. The second question, which was about whether or not companies receive incentives. In Switzerland, the short answer is no. And the reason is because they make money off it. So they don't need to. This is why if you ask people who are involved in this in companies in Switzerland, generally they will speak very positively about it. And generally they're kind of happy with the way things currently are, because they don't feel that they need it. That being said, there are always exceptions to these kinds of things, and there might be some kind of indirect support for, particularly for jobs that, and now I'm thinking of jobs that you access with an apprenticeship in Switzerland that might be becoming more and more rare, but still we need to make sure that they are, that they are filled. A lot of things like making musical instruments, for instance. Now, this is an apprenticeship in Switzerland, and we see it as being still an important apprenticeship because it kind of is, it's important for cultural heritage and for a good cultural life and that kind of thing. But there are not very many places that offer this. And that means that in some cases, the government might have to step in to make that happen one way or another. The other one that I can obviously think of is healthcare, for instance. So nursing is an apprenticeship-based profession in Switzerland. And since health is generally public anyway, although we have a very strange health insurance system, but the bigger hospitals are public officially. That means that obviously public money is flowing into it one way or another, because the companies themselves are publicly funded anyway. But if you want to think about like an average manufacturing company that has 5 or 6 apprentices, no, they generally won't receive subsidies. And the reason, or any other kind of support, administrative support certainly, but financial support, no. But that's because they basically don't need it.
Gracias.
Okay, I will very quickly answer the other question that I saw in the chat, and my basic Spanish was enough to understand that it's asking whether or not there's a minimum program duration. In this particular model, we're not considering one. I will show you some different program durations in the next few slides, varying basically between 1 year and up to 4 years. And you'll be able to see for yourself how that affects the costs and the benefits. So I'm going to move on to the next section, which is no longer just looking at kind of a model, but rather looking at some actual results from different countries. And so I'm going to show you some programs that are at various levels of establishment through different countries. So some that are relatively recent, some that have come up in the last decade or so, and some that are really quite new. So the first one that I'm going to show you it's called the Skills Future Earn and Learn program that comes from Singapore. So first thing to say, the program duration is 1 to 1.5 years, 12 to 18 months, and students spend 80% of their time in the workplace. But when we look at the different costs and the benefits that the companies have, we can see that the companies have a considerably higher level of yearly costs for the students than they generate some kind of benefit. And they have a net cost of about 10,000 Singapore dollars a year from participating in this program. And for context, the average wage in Singapore is somewhere around 50 to 60,000 Singapore dollars per year. So that means that about a fifth of an average worker's wage is being lost in net costs in this particular program. And the reason for that is, well, there's a couple. For the fact that the participant labor costs, so this is the wages that the apprentices are receiving, are higher than their productive value. So a participant is receiving a wage of around about 25,000, a little bit more than 25,000 Singapore dollars per year from training, for participating in the program. They're generating a benefit for the company that's under 20,000 Singapore dollars. So already there you can see that in terms of the wages, there's a mismatch. That might be okay if other things were in balance, but we can see that they're also not. The companies here reported quite high on the job training costs. So again, about 15,000 Singapore dollars per year. And they also reported some hiring administration costs and planning costs, and they make a small contribution to classroom education as well. And as I said, the benefits to the productive value of the students is relatively low. The government tries to kick in a little bit of subsidy with that to sort of cover that difference, but it's not enough to cover all of the costs. Although the companies, again, they say that the saved adjustment costs and the saved hiring costs also make a little bit of a difference. When we piece all that together, what it basically means is it looks like apprentices in Singapore are spending a lot of time in the workplace, up to 4 days a week, but the program looks like it's too short. So 1 to 1.5 years is not enough time for an apprentice to realize their full productive potential, meaning that this imbalance here between the light blue on this side and the darker red on this side basically stays that way. So if they're not being given the chance to come to their full productive potential, meaning that their labor costs are not being covered by their productivity throughout the program. The training costs themselves, though, are also relatively high. And again, that's probably got to do with the fact that they're spending a really large part of the week in the workplace, but apparently not doing a great deal of productive work, which means that they probably have to be highly supervised a lot of the time, meaning that this is costing the companies a lot in terms of the wages of the supervisors, and probably also costing them in terms of equipment and that kind of thing that is really only being used for training purposes. And so with those two things together, you have a program that's slightly too short, you have wages that are relatively high, and you have high training costs. You end up in this situation where the net costs of the program is about 10,000 Singapore dollars per year. So this is an example of a program that's losing money, basically. I'm going to move on to 3 programs in Europe. We don't have the same level of detail on the kinds of costs and the kinds of benefits for these 3 programs, but basically what I want to show you is that 3 really well-established programs that on the surface look very similar come to very different outcomes. And so I'm showing you the example of Switzerland, Germany, and Austria. This data is getting a little bit old now. It's about 10 years or so old, and we really should update it. But I unfortunately didn't have the time to do it before this presentation. But what I can tell you here is that we have 3 countries where apprenticeships generally last somewhere between 2 and 4 years. Now, I'll give you the example of Switzerland. In Switzerland, most apprenticeships are 3, often 4 years. But we have the 4 years are especially for things where there's a lot of dangerous or really technical work. So things like carpentry, metal work, anything that involves construction sites or heavy machinery will often be a 4-year program to make sure that they have done the right kind of safety training as well to be able to do these jobs properly. A lot of other ones, so commercial employees are more likely to be 3 years. But we also have special 2-year programs that are generally for people with learning difficulties. So they can still be involved in a workplace apprenticeship and still get some level of qualification, but it's generally related to simpler tasks and it's shorter. So what we can see that also the workplace training, it varies a little bit by the year that you're in and by the occupation that you're in, but in these countries, generally 60–80%. What we see, though, is only in one country do the companies, on average, and I really want to stress on average, make a net benefit, and that's Switzerland. So in Switzerland, the costs to an average company of an average apprentice per year are a little under 80,000. This is in euros so that we can make the comparison. And the benefits are a little under 90,000. So you're having about a 10,000 euro net benefit. And again, a minimum wage, a median wage in Switzerland at this time would have been about, let's say, 70,000 euros. So just to kind of put it into comparison. In Germany, on the other hand, the costs are lower. They're about 50,000 euros per year, but the benefit is also lower. They only make about 40,000, a little bit less in net benefit. And so therefore there is a loss to the company of about 15,000 euros per year. And this would be in a context where the average, the minimum median average wage would be somewhere about 45,000 euros, somewhere between 40 and 45,000 euros. Similar story in Austria. Costs are a bit higher, closer to 70,000 euros. And the benefit that they derive is around about 60,000. And so we have about a 10,000 euro difference. Median salary is probably slightly higher, but not considerably higher than in Germany. So why do we have similar programs with different outcomes, and why are German and Austrian companies still training? And the simple explanation is that for starters, Swiss apprentices are generally permitted to do more productive work, especially than their counterparts in Germany. In Germany, the apprentices do a lot of apprentice-only work, even in the company, that isn't generating productive value. This is often down to labor laws and regulations with young people working, whereas in Switzerland, they really are allowed to do productive work a lot of the time. In Austria, it's partly because the government, to a certain extent, got into a little bit of a bidding war on apprentice wages, and they kept increasing apprentice wages to make apprenticeships more attractive compared to going on to university. And that means that now the costs in terms of how much you have to pay your apprentices are quite high, and they're not quite generating the benefit for the companies to compensate for that. However, what should be said about Germany especially is that the German companies often invest in apprentices because the different labor market dynamics mean that apprentices very, very often stay on in their company afterwards. And so the companies do this as a kind of a future investment strategy. There's also a little bit of a kind of a political or even an economic expectation that this is just what companies do in these contexts, that a good company that's doing the right thing by the community is a company that offers a chance for a young person to do an apprenticeship and prepare themselves for their future. And so there's also a little bit of that kind of pressure on a lot of companies to offer apprenticeships, even though it costs them something. And so it's generally just a part of a cost of doing business for a lot of companies in these contexts. Okay, the final one that I want to show you, and then we can have another Q&A round. I think this is about, no, I have a couple more things to show. This is a relatively new program in Nepal. that is being supported by the SDC, the Swiss Development Agency, and by a couple of Swiss NGOs, notably by Helvetas, where they've implemented a pilot apprenticeship program in a set of companies, in a set of industries in Nepal. It lasts for 2 years, and the apprentices spend about 80% of their time in the workplace. What you can see here is that the costs, I'm afraid it's flipped from the Singapore graph. The costs are not particularly high. The apprentice wages are about 100,000 rupees per year, which is, they were set at about 60% of the minimum wage, or yes, of the minimum wage. And the instructor costs are also a little under 100,000 rupees per year. They don't report any other kind of costs. They also don't report any other kind of benefits except for the productive contribution of the apprentices, but the productive contribution of the apprentices in this case is really high. It's about 300,000 rupees per year, which means that in Nepal they have a net benefit to this pilot program of over 100,000 rupees per year. And again, this is about a quarter of a worker's wage, of an average worker's wage in these companies per year. So holding these costs relatively low and allowing a fair bit of productive contribution from the apprentices leads to a pretty large net benefit. And this holds when we observe it in different company sizes and in different industries, which I have on the next slide. So we split it into micro companies, companies with less than 10 employees, and then anything with more than 10. You can see that the ones with more than 10 do generate a somewhat higher net benefit, but the smaller companies also, they have lower benefits, they also have lower costs, and they're also generating net benefits out of the program. It's similar for the sector. So we had manufacturing occupations and service occupations. Again, the manufacturing occupations, they have similar benefits across the two sectors, but the costs are a bit higher, which makes sense in a manufacturing occupation that they need a bit more supervision. Also, wages in manufacturing is generally a bit higher than they are in service industries in Nepal. That means that the net benefits are a bit lower for these manufacturing occupations, but they're still quite significant. And so it really does seem that across the board, that the companies in Nepal who were involved in this pilot program were doing pretty well. The question, of course, is well, this is great for the companies, but what about the students, or what about the apprentices? And I can tell you that on a macro level, and this is really looking worldwide, dual education, so education that involves at least a third of the time in the companies, but as we've seen, in order to generate a net benefit, you really need to up that to 60, perhaps even 80%, leads to lower unemployment, less long-term unemployment, better wages, and more full-time employment for young people. And this is causal evidence that colleagues of mine have collected from several different countries around the world that basically shows the higher your dual VET rate is, the better you are doing on all of these measures. But specifically, to have actually a look at the students that were involved in this pilot program in Nepal, well, we asked them every year whether or not they were happy with the program, and generally they said they were. There was a dip after they went back to after the, I don't know, a lot of these programs were stopped during COVID. It dipped a little bit after they went back into the companies, but it picked up again a little bit 1 year after they graduated. And importantly, the people, so we had the opportunity to track the people who were in the apprenticeship program, as well as people who applied for it and didn't get in. And so what we can see is that the non-apprentices, so the one who didn't get in, as opposed to the apprentices, the ones who did, they're a lot more likely to be working, and they're a lot less likely to be inactive. And that's particularly the case for women, which is a really important point in Nepal, where women's workplace participation is still very low. The inactivity rate is considerably lower, and the working rate, the number of people who are actually in jobs, is higher. So to pull all of that together, we can see that in some cases, companies are training despite net costs. This might be because of legal requirements or local expectations or long-term investment in mind. The net costs usually arise because the training costs are too high, which is generally because the wages are too high, or because skilled workers have to spend too much time supervising, because the programs are too short, or because apprentices are not allowed to do enough productive work. And so in the examples we saw, Singapore has a high net cost because they have high training costs, but also a short program. So these are two things that are not good for the cost benefit equation for the companies. In Switzerland, there are high net benefits despite the high costs because the programs are long enough and apprentices are productive enough. And Nepal has net benefits because of low costs and high productivity. For the apprentices to be profitable enough for both the companies and the participants, they need to be long enough. They need to have enough opportunities for apprentices to increase their productivity and keep their costs in check. And that means that usually these dual training has considerable benefits for students in terms of employment outcomes. And when we ask them if they're satisfied, they usually say yes. So that's a sort of a brief conclusion for this particular part of the presentation. I guess we can stop to take another set of questions here if you like, and then I can go on to some evidence that we collected from Chile.
Súper interesante, así que bueno, los invitamos a hacer preguntas por el chat y mientras tanto se inspiran con una pregunta que puede ser ahora o más adelante. Una pregunta que podríamos hacerle a Patrick es, Patrick, ¿existen estudios hoy día o hay iniciativas que tú conozcas donde se esté revisando, por ejemplo, cuáles son las competencias que estos jóvenes que tienen mayor éxito en esta experiencia dual de formación? Existen ciertas, nosotros en lo organizacional hoy día se habla de las famosas power skills. Entonces, lo que te quiero preguntar si es que hay algún estudio, ustedes lo están haciendo o otros lo están haciendo, que hablen de cuáles serían esas otras competencias distintas de la formación técnica que podrían los jóvenes empezar a tener a la vista para tener una mejor experiencia.
It's a great question, Andrea, and yes, we do have some evidence on this. So we have been doing some surveys with companies and also looking at some other data to ask about the kinds of skills that companies lack and the kind of skills that they think are best learned in the workplace. What we generally see is that obviously apprenticeships are very good at delivering the specific skills that people need for their occupations, but they're also a really good place for young people to learn soft skills. And indeed a better place for them to learn soft skills than in the workplace. And so we're talking about things like teamwork, about reliability, about motivation, which we also observe in the data that we have and that we analyze are really increasing in importance. We have a monitor of all of the job advertisements in Switzerland from about 1950, even earlier, I think, up until today. And when you look at these, you can see that the number of job advertisements that are asking for soft skills in general is exploding. And so that means that somebody who has an apprenticeship will often be considered to be better off in that particular field than somebody who doesn't. And that also means that that yes, an apprenticeship is not just learning the specific skills for your new occupation, but about these kinds of skills. And this makes intuitive sense when you think about it, I think, because when you come into a workplace, you're confronted with lots of people doing lots of different tasks, people of different ages, people with all sorts of different responsibilities, perhaps different hierarchies and that kind of thing. When you're in a classroom or a lecture hall, there's usually a group of students who are all of a similar age generally and have similar a teacher or a lecturer, and that's it. So the complexity of the work environment means that learning these kinds of skills that you need to know to navigate the workplace or the labor market well also means that this is a really useful place to learn those sorts of skills too.
Gracias.
I will just jump in here. Juan Esteban, you had raised your hand. Please go ahead if you want to make a comment.
Let me congratulate you, Patrick, for your presentation. It has been very useful for us to understand better. And I heard you several weeks ago, you presented a huge investigation that you have conducted with Dr. Reynolds and ETH was very insight for us. And let me share with you that we implemented in 2021 and research with ETH, with Paola Bordón and Fundación Chile Dual, where we analyzed all the costs and the benefits that we have had here in Chile in a few companies. And we saw that the high cost rather than benefits is present in our field. We have long-term to cover because the productivity of our students into our environmental among the companies is not enough productive for them. We know that the productivity increase is a gain during the time, 2 or 3 years, as you mentioned, but it's a challenge to us as a country, as a companies in Chile, to implement that because the duration of our programs was a little bit short. But I think that at the end it's very useful, your presentation for us, mainly to show to other companies the way to implement that kind of things and to discuss in a business language the same thing that the business are dealing. When you said the cost and benefits, you're in the line of the business reality, and by doing that we can be a better player in that field, not human player but business player. I think it's extremely important, the language and the mindset that we can implement to sell that kind of things, because we need to sell that. We need to sell because we are fighting with the business in terms of the time and the budgets, and of course the those things is not easy. It's not an easy way.
It's really great that you mentioned that, Juan Esteban, and thank you very much for your perspective on it, because it's exactly what I'm going to talk about in the last part of the presentation. I'm going to present the very study that I know that Nestlé and Chile Dual had supported us to implement as a part of the project. So why don't I, since I've been given a great segue into it, go on? You've already heard, I think, probably now the most important element of it from Juan Esteban, but I will show you some of the more let's say, so some of the more precise statistics on it. Is that, Andrea, is that okay? I see you've turned your microphone off. On, I mean. Okay, I'll keep going. So yeah, in 2020 and 2021, a group of researchers that was centered around us here in the Chair of Education Systems, but also with Professor Paola Bordón in Chile, supported by Nestlé and by Chile Dual, sent out a survey to 950 Chilean companies that offer dual training. We received 313 responses back, and from those 313, we had 109 that provided enough information for us to do some kind of a meaningful analysis. And so now we know from these companies what the costs that they have are, what the productive contribution that the trainees made during the period, and we also know how satisfied that they are with the participation in the dual training. And when I look at all of this, I can say that there is some bad news off the top, but there is some good news that might give a little bit of hope for how this sort of program could go forward. So first thing to say is that the programs cost about 3.3 million pesos per student. And the costs are broken down in the student labor costs here are not super high compared to other programs. They're about 28% of the costs overall. The training costs are a bit higher. They take up nearly 60%. And then we have some small costs here also linked to the cost of supplies and administrative costs as well, which take up about 15% of that overall amount. You can see, as you might expect, this varies by industry. This is not the same absolutely everywhere. So the costs are considerably higher, for instance, in electrical industries or in the chemical or metal and mechanical than they are in, for instance, health and education or in administration, hotel services, that sort of thing. Again, these kinds of industries that require a lot of heavy machinery, that require a lot of technical knowledge and that sort of thing, often cost more than the ones that are often more client-facing or involve office work, which I think makes sense. So the program benefits, the average benefit per student was about 1.2 million pesos. And this is mostly down to 80% of this is down to the productive value, but also a fairly considerable component, according to the companies, to saved adjustment costs, about 20%, and a little bit also on saved hiring costs. There's a bit of variation, although a little bit less on the benefits than there was on the costs. The agricultural students had a higher benefit than did a lot of the others. It's quite a bit lower in, for instance, administration, hotel and food, also lower though in construction, electrical, and that kind of thing, and really quite low in health and education. And this might be due to the fact that health and education, especially, there are a lot of laws on, you can't necessarily have an apprentice giving vaccines to patients and that kind of thing. And so they have to do a lot of non-productive training in that field. So the balance sheet then looks a little bit like this. We have really quite high costs for low benefits, and that means that the net cost for the average company is a little bit over 2 million pesos per student, which is quite considerable when you look at the net costs are well over double the benefit that the average company is able to make here. So that's the bad news, basically. The programs cost quite a bit. They're not making much because the students are not very productive, and that means that the companies who are involved have quite high net costs. So what's behind the net cost? And when we were talking about program length, well, these programs are about 14 months long on average. And that means that the productive value of the apprentices only crosses over the amount that they cost just before their program is done. And at that point, they're free to do what they want. So that basically means you could say, all right, well, let's make the program longer. But of course, that's very complicated for companies because this is a part of a formal education program where a lot of this is already defined. But certainly, if you made the program 2 years rather than 14 months, you might not see this difference completely go away, but it would make a big big difference to the productive value, because if it keeps going up like that and the costs keep diminishing, then you would certainly see at some point that there might be the possibility of at least some companies starting to generate a net benefit out of this. There is some other things that you could do. The first thing you could do is you could increase the productive value. I'm again treating the right-hand side before I am treating the left-hand side of the value. Get the students to do more productive work while they're in the company. And that has two effects. The first is that it increases the productive value of the student because they spend more hours doing things that actually have a benefit to the company, but it also decreases the training costs because it means that the trainers probably have to be less hands-on with the students while they are there. And that means that in this example here, and I really want to say this is a model. This is not something that we have actually put figures to be able to say, well, if you increased it by this much and decrease that by that much, then after 8 months, the company would be making a return. That's not what this is saying. This is kind of just an illustration, but it is an example to kind of show that if you allowed the students to spend more time doing productive work, that also has the knock-on effect of having productive workers having to spend less time hands-on with the student, and you might have a longer period of return. You can, of course, also talk about introducing subsidies. Now, when we look at this, we generally say don't do that. The reason that we say don't do that is because it to an extent is just a windfall profit, and it doesn't attack the main problem, which is that the program might be too short or that the students aren't productive enough. So basically it says, okay, we're going to keep everything as it is in the program, but we know that the program isn't working as it should, therefore we're going to subsidize it. We think that that's an inefficient way to go about it, but it is also true to say that of course, if you did subsidize it by, for example, this much, you would see a similar outcome. But again, our academic advice is it's better to focus on really trying to lift the productivity if that's what you can, especially if it's not in your power to extend the length of the program. The other good news, though, is that despite the fact that this is costing companies who are involved, they're generally satisfied. So we asked companies in Chile who are involved in these programs, are you satisfied with it overall? And you can see that over 60% say they're either satisfied or very satisfied. So the majority are saying that and only 4% are saying that they have some level of dissatisfaction with the program. Even in terms of the net costs, only 15% say they're dissatisfied. The level who say they're satisfied are a little bit less, but still a majority are either satisfied or very satisfied. And finally, in terms of the skill provision that the companies report having through being involved in these programs, they're overwhelmingly satisfied. 90% of companies who are involved in these apprenticeship programs say that they are satisfied or very satisfied with the skills that they provide to be able to let their companies grow. So this is a really, really important message, because it means that if you get some of the other parameters right, if you make it so that the costs aren't so high, and you're not going to go from having a program that costs a lot today to a program that's making a benefit tomorrow, but if you can start working on some of the levers that you can pull, that means that there is a story there that might get more businesses involved, because businesses who are involved can see that they're happy with it overall, but they're especially happy with it because it provides a talent pipeline for them to be able to grow and thrive into the future. They also, when we ask them, well, what is the relevance of their participation, they basically say that almost all of these different things are relevant to being participants. So a little less on the saving and recruitment costs or replacing unskilled employees, but avoiding hiring the wrong person, training junior employees, enhancing worker leadership, which goes a little bit back to some of the discussion we were having earlier on, reducing turnover, securing section and region supply, obtaining skilled employees, hiring the best participants, and engaging with the community. These are all really relevant to companies who are involved in this kind of training in Chile. So again, these are the kinds of stories that we can tell to say, well, getting involved in this isn't just a kind of a thing that you do out of nothing. There is a relevance to it. And it's a relevance in terms of in obtaining the employees that you need with the skills that you want, and really engaging and showing that you're a part of the community so that people are interested in working for you and buying your products and that sort of thing. So I'm noticing the time, and I know we want to save some time for final question and answer and discussion. So I'm going to come to a conclusion here, which is to say that I think when I look at all of this together, the conditions are in place for expanding dual education in Chile, because employers see a benefit in the participation of dual education when they're in it. And they're generally satisfied with their participation, even in spite of the net costs that they have. So some of the possibilities available to turn the costs into the return: of course, you can use subsidies to cover losses, but that doesn't get to the heart of the issue, which is increasing the time that students can spend doing productive work, because that raises their productivity, but it also reduces their training costs because you don't have to be so hands-on as a supervisor. And of course, if you really want to go out there and fight for a change in the education program overall, you can tell the government that these programs need to be longer, and see whether or not you get any pushback on that, because that extends the amount of time that you're able to get a return out of the program. Although, of course, you can also see it as a kind of investment in future talent, so that will pay off as you move forward. That's all for my presentation for now. And I would then like to say that we have some more time for more questions. I can also see, I put my email address in there, but of course, when it's switched to a hyperlink, you can't actually see it properly on the background. But perhaps, Elise, you can feel free to share my, my contact details with anybody. You can find me on LinkedIn, as you can find everyone on LinkedIn, and I'm more than happy to discuss further once we've finished the discussion here.
Súper interesante, Patrick. Primero darte las gracias. La verdad que ha sido, el tiempo pasó volando y todo lo que nos has compartido, bueno, nos deja súper entusiasmados. Además que en Chile está claro que podemos hacer mucho más de lo que estamos haciendo y existen condiciones, de acuerdo a lo que tú comentas, que podríamos hacer más empresas que quieran participar en esto de darle oportunidades a los jóvenes para introducirse en el mercado laboral, porque esto le hace bien a los jóvenes, nos hace bien como país y le hace bien a las empresas. Yo siempre cuento, Patrick, que las grandes empresas son aquellas que tienen grandes personas. Y me encantaría que haya un ranking de las mejores empresas que son las que generen mayores plazas de empleo y empleo de calidad. Ese es un sueño que tengo de ojalá exista ese ranking pronto. Y ahora una pregunta. Cuando ustedes han hecho la investigación, y no sé si has tocado estos datos, pero tengo la impresión, por lo que decías al final, sobre todo, de lo que pasa en Chile en cuanto a lo que se valora más, es que cuando nosotros nos acercamos a una organización, a veces nuestro interlocutor para que un joven entre a ser parte de un programa de formación es una persona que tiene un rol que podría ser un gerente de recursos humanos o un gerente de gestión de personas. Pero muchas veces en organizaciones más grandes existen otros roles, como un gerente de sostenibilidad o un gerente que esté trabajando en temas de cultura o el gerente de finanzas y administración, porque hay empresas donde no están todos estos roles. Entonces, lo que te quiero preguntar es, ¿será que quizás también para promover más esto deberíamos tomar en cuenta que quienes toman las decisiones para promover, hacer crecer o desaparecer un programa de formación dual en los estudiantes tiene que ver también con quién es el interlocutor en la organización, que finalmente puede ser el que esté tomando la decisión? ¿Qué piensas al respecto?
I think that it's an extremely pertinent observation. And I can kind of give you a bit of an anecdote to explain why, rather than referring to data, which does exist, but I'm not such an expert on it. Switzerland is, again, we are very committed to this model, but we also see that in a lot of places the number of the number of people doing apprenticeships is falling back a little bit. It's fallen back from a little over 70% to about 65% in the past few years, and we're also seeing that some companies are less and less interested in offering it, and the companies that are less interested in offering it are often the companies where executive leadership comes from outside of Switzerland. They don't know the system. And so they come in and they say, well, I don't understand this, and I've always hired people for this job with a master's degree in this, and so I expect that people have a master's degree in this. On the other hand, we see some big companies that are still really, really strongly committed to this. And one classic example that we always like to use when we talk about this, because we also like to show, well, when you do an apprenticeship, you can get to this level. So UBS, the only big international bank we now have left in Switzerland, the CEO was an apprentice. He was a banking apprentice. And he went all the way from a banking apprenticeship to running our largest bank. And so you can bet that UBS has a very, very, very strong apprenticeship program, because if even the CEO is convinced of the value of it, because he did it himself, then of course he's going to make sure that it's still that it's still available. So yes, the short answer to your question is that workplace culture in general, but specifically the people who are in the right positions defending this is really important.
Muchas gracias. Entonces hay un concepto de liderazgo ejecutivo que puede hacer una diferencia adicional dentro de las variables que mostraste. Hay un tema decisional, ¿cierto? Y que podríamos apoyar más esto. Qué bueno.
Yes, definitely.
Bueno, ¿qué les parece si Juan Esteban o alguno de nuestros otros participantes, si quisieran hacer un comentario, quizás una pregunta a Patrick para aprovechar el tiempo que nos queda y ya empezamos a cerrar esta reunión que ha sido muy interesante? ¿Sí? Así que los invito.
Patrick, just a comment regarding the duration or the length of the program. In Chile, we have 2 years by regulation to implement dual education. In the last 2 years of the education high school. But we have implemented in Nestle the hiring process after both years, 2 years, because we have a law, special law here to recruit youngers. By having that, we can extend the time, and we can continuous investment over education, because we can offer them a high education in technical institutions like INACAP or DUOC. INACAP is a huge technical education here in Chile, and I can imagine that we can extend the measurement. We can extend the measurement for the 2 or 3 years more, plus the 2 previous years under the college or high school education. It's just a comment, because for us has been very good implementation, because the productivity by having this kind of programs is huge. It's a very high. I remember in 2019 at ETHZ in CEMET summer camp, I heard that at the end of the program in Switzerland, one person can catch up the 25% of the productivity of a regular employee who has been not included into the company by that kind of things. 27, 25% of productivity is a huge amount. We are achieving, of course, less than that, but in a similar way by having that kind of things, that kind of programs here in Nestle in Chile.
I think you're right, and I'd be very curious, and perhaps this is something that we can speak to Paula about, if we want to look at the companies that do offer this additional time once the official 2 years of the upper secondary school is done, then yes, because then I think again it creates the possibility to have a discussion about that based on real experience and analysis to say, well, okay, yes, fine, in the 2 years that they are officially doing their grade 11 and grade 12, you're not going to make a net benefit. It would be a heroic effort for any company to get any kind of net benefit out of young people in that period of time, just because there's so much to learn. But if your program continues, then you can really see the way that it takes off. I think it's a really useful and important observation.
At the end, it's an investment,
of course,
a long-term investment for companies. Your view should be in the long term, not in the short term. That is a problem, but the business is dealing with the short term.
Of course, yeah.
The person that Andrea mentioned, when we talk with the CEOs or CFOs and so on, it's difficult because short term versus long term.
Yeah, it's a tension that I think is always going to be there. So yeah, thanks. I think it's really interesting to hear your perspective on it. So thank you.
I have a quick question to follow up with Juan Esteban's intervention. When you measure the duration of apprenticeship training on one of the graphics you showed us before, where we can see the 2 curves and where they cross, and suddenly the apprenticeship stops. And I think it was at the beginning of the presentation, or this graphic.
This one, yeah.
So by end of the program, it's usually when the apprenticeship training stops, but can you tell which of these apprentices stay within the company and which actually leave the company? Do you have statistics for that? Because I guess it should be considered in a way, or how could we measure that benefit that is acquired after the apprenticeship if the apprentice stays at the company? Is it considered part of the benefit of the apprenticeship, or do you measure it then differently as the benefit of hiring someone as if it were an external candidate?
So it relies on a couple of things. Firstly, it relies on the company keeping a good record of that. We didn't ask it specifically in this. So in this particular questionnaire, we didn't ask, do your apprentices stay on or not? But what we did ask, and this goes back a little bit to, I guess, oh no, I've gone too far. This here. Saved hiring costs and saved adjustment costs. So yes, the short answer is we don't stop measuring it at the end of the program in that sense. We also do take into account the fact that if they stay, it costs that the apprentices, not the apprentices, the companies are saving money because they don't have to go through a hiring process for skilled worker necessarily, and they don't have to go through this adjustment period. What we see here suggests that this is not an enormous part of the equation for the average company in Chile yet. But it nevertheless, certainly in terms of the adjustment cost, it's a fifth basically of the benefits that they make. So it's true that what I showed here, this really is the program only. But afterwards, yes, we can look at it in terms of whether or not the companies report that they're saving on the hiring and the adjustment that they would otherwise had to have done. That's kind of the mechanism that we look at.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I guess measuring benefits and costs look quite straightforward when we look at your graphics, but it's rather technical and complicated.
It's extremely complex, and but yeah, we've settled on a model that we think works pretty well and is fairly intuitive and easy enough to understand.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So I guess if there aren't any more questions, time is up, and we would like to thank you all very much for participating in this webinar. Thank you so much, Patrick, for these insights. Really, I think we've all learned a lot, and even I have been working with you in the past. I have learned many things, and I would like also to, before we close, to address a point that was raised before in the questions. And it's clear that there's a pressing need for maybe greater flexibility in terms of educational systems and the labor market. And yeah, to truly maximize the benefits of apprenticeship programs, our educational institutions as well and businesses should work closely together. So to all the companies here, member companies of the chamber, this is also a call to action to work closely, and we're glad that we have Nestle here, who's clearly an example of how to integrate education within their business model. So this means adapting curricula to meet the evolving demands of the industry, creating pathways that allow for a seamless transition from learning to working, which is crucial for youth and labor markets in general, how, as you've showed it, Patrick. So thank you so much, and we look forward to having you in future webinars, and hopefully presentially as well here in Chile, if a new investigation process and collaboration as the one that happened, correct me if I'm wrong, it was in 2019 that Regula Reynolds came here, the head of the chair of education systems. So thank you very much for your participation. Thank you, Andrea, for moderating and for the very relevant questions. Thank you to Fabiola, which had to leave before, and thank you, Daniel and Rodrigo, for your interpretation and translation of this webinar, which ran smoothly, hopefully. So We look forward to seeing you, and as Fabiola mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, next week we'll have a very important event at the Ambassador's Residence, which will be the official launch of the agreement on education, juvenile employment as well, and employment, fostering employment for people who are less than 28 years old. So this will be an important event which will share and also will have a press release about this event. So we're going to close this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in future events from the chamber. Thanks to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick. Bye-bye.
Adiós. Gracias a todos.